She wasn't just beheaded. The shocking truth about Marie Antoinette's final days. The cold October wind cut through the streets of Paris like a blade, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and smoke. Inside the conciergerie, a damp, decaying prison once used to house criminals, Marie Antoinette sat in silence. The queen who had once dazzled Versailles with diamonds and silk was now dressed in a coarse gray gown, her hair crudely chopped to expose her neck. No mirror, no crown, no attendants. Just stone walls, straw, and a single flickering candle dot. She no longer wept. She no longer pleaded. Those emotions had long since been exhausted. Now what remained was something colder resignation, maybe. Or something darker still, the deep, aching stillness of a soul that had been starved of dignity for too long. In the final days of her life, Marie was not just condemned. She was deconstructed. Not simply beheaded, but unmade, piece by piece. Until the scaffold was simply the last step in a much longer execution. The revolution had once promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. But by October of 1793, it had become something else. Something hungry, something theatrical. The king was already dead, executed 9 months earlier to the cheers of a roaring crowd. But Marie, she was different. She wasn't just a royal. She was a symbol, a scapegoat, a woman painted as the cause of all of France's suffering. To kill her was not just justice, it was performance. They called her Madame Deficit, blamed her for famine, for war, for opulence. They whispered lies in taverns and shouted them in the streets. That she bathed in milk while children starved. That she plotted with Austria to destroy France. That she had seduced her own son. Truth became irrelevant. The mob needed a monster, and she played the part they had written for her, whether she wanted to or not. The final stage of her life began in isolation. After her husband's death, she had been moved to a separate cell, filthy, overcrowded, and under constant surveillance. Her children were torn from her. Her sister-in-law sent to another prison. Her guards never left her side, not even when she changed her undergarments. For Marie, once accustomed to the luxury of privacy, this was not merely imprisonment, it was psychological dismemberment. When they came for her son, her little boy, Louis Charles, she fought, but the guards overpowered her. He was taken, re-educated, abused, and turned into a witness against her. In a cruel twist, he would later testify that his mother had molested him, a charge so grotesque, so transparently false, that even some revolutionaries flinched. But the wheels were already turning. The trial would proceed, that there would be no real defense. Her appointed lawyer was brave, but powerless. The outcome had been decided before the courtroom was even prepared. The tribunal was not interested in truth. They were interested in symbolism. The Queen of France, now merely Widow Capet, would be reduced, humiliated, destroyed before the eyes of a nation trained to forget her humanity. And yet, throughout it all, Marie remained composed, not dignified in the way stories often suggest, not regal and cold, but quiet, hollow. Her body thinner now, ravaged by months of grief and illness. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. She wrote letters to her children. She prayed. She waited. There is a kind of madness that grows in confinement, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and creeping. Marie began to show signs of that slow unraveling. Long silences, sudden laughter, moments of detachment. It wasn't courage. It was survival. On the morning of October 16, 1793, she was awakened before dawn. The guards told her it was time. She rose without a word, dressed in the same gray gown, tied a white bonnet over her shorn hair. There would be no royal carriage, no velvet, no decorum, only a wooden cart open to the elements, flanked by drummers and jeering citizens. It was the same cart used for common criminals. That was the point. She stood for hours during the journey from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, her hands bound behind her back. Crowds lined the streets, not with pity, but with hatred. Some spat, others laughed. Children climbed onto rooftops to catch a glimpse. For the revolutionaries, this was not a moment of mourning. It was a spectacle. The public death of a queen who had become a monster in their collective imagination. And Marie? She stood, silent, pale, and utterly alone, as the cart rolled through the streets of Paris. Marie Antoinette remained still, her back straight despite the rough movement of the wooden wheels beneath her. The cold morning air whipped at her face. But she did not shiver. Her hands, bound tightly behind her back with coarse rope, had already lost sensation. Blood no longer reached her fingers properly. Her shoulders ached, but she showed no sign of it. Her silence became its own form of defiance. She was not escorted with reverence. The guards made no effort to shield her from the abuse hurled by. The crowd. She heard everything, every insult, every cheer for her death, every crude taunt about her body and her past. Some shouted that she should suffer, as the people had suffered. Others laughed as they mocked her once beautiful gowns, her Austrian accent, her supposed crimes. Her name had become a curse. Her identity twisted into something grotesque. They no longer saw a person. They saw a symbol, a hollow vessel, into which they had poured all their rage and despair. When the cart reached the Place de la Révolution, the crowd surged forward. Thousands had gathered. Workers, housewives, soldiers, drunks, and children all jostling for a view. The scaffold loomed above them, flanked by National Guards and the ever-present guillotine. Red-stained wood, a wicker basket, a blade glinting in the pale sunlight. The drums beat steadily, echoing through the square like a heartbeat made of war-got Marie was pulled roughly from the cart. Her ankles wobbled as she adjusted to standing on solid ground, but she did not stumble. Her dress, now caked with dirt and old sweat, brushed against the wooden steps. The executioner offered no words of comfort, only instruction. She was to ascend the scaffold, stand before the people, and wait. That was all. She obeyed as she climbed the steps. She stepped briefly on the executioner's foot and instinctively whispered, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." It would be her final words. A fragment of civility in a world that had forgotten what civility meant. She did not deliver a grand speech. No final condemnation. No plea for justice. Just an apology, soft and almost absurd in the face of death. But it revealed something vital. She was still human. Atop the scaffold, she stood for a moment as the crowd roared. She did not look at them. Her eyes moved instead toward the sky-gray, unmoving, endless. There was no priest to offer comfort, no husband beside her, no allies. Only the sound of the blade being prepared, the crowd's restless murmur, and the cold. The executioner pulled her bonnet from her head, exposing the choppy remnants of her once celebrated hair. She was guided to the guillotine, and the collar was fastened, the plank beneath her body tilted forward, her face pressed against the wood. Her neck exposed. No one counted down. No one paused for solemnity. And then the blade fell. It struck with a sound so final, so absolute, that even the most fervent in the crowd fell briefly quiet. The thud of the blade, the dull crash of her body, the slap of her severed head into the basket. For a moment, Paris held its breath. Then came the cheers. The executioner held her head aloft, blood dripping down his arm, and turned toward the crowd. A symbolic offering. The death of a queen made visible to a nation. The drums resumed. The crowd roared again. The air filled with the smell of blood and sweat and iron. But beneath the spectacle, something deeper stirred. A discomfort. a dissonance. The reality of what had been done flickered through the cracks of the narrative. Some turned away, some left in silence. Others drank and sang and clapped. But no one who watched would forget the sight, because in that moment, Marie Antoinette was no longer a villain. She was no longer the scapegoat of a starving country. She was simply a woman, broken, humiliated, alone, and then gone. Her body, now lifeless and anonymous, was stripped of any remaining dignity. The executioners did not linger. They cleaned the blood from the scaffold with buckets of water while assistants gathered her. Remains with mechanical efficiency. Her severed head was placed beside her torso in the wicker basket, and both were loaded into a simple coffin made of rough pine. There were no flowers, no ceremony, no prayers. She was taken not to a crypt or royal tomb, but to a mass grave in the nearby Madeleine Cemetery, an unmarked pit filled with the bodies of others who had met the same end. There, the Queen of France disappeared into the earth. No monument was raised, no cross was placed. The ground swallowed her in silence, but the silence would not hold. Within days of her death, the streets of Paris moved on. Bread was still scarce, the economy still broken, and the bloodshed, far from satisfying the hunger of the people, only seemed to increase it. The reign of terror was just beginning its darkest phase. New names appeared on lists. New enemies of the revolution were declared, and the guillotine, that efficient machine of justice, continued to fall daily. The woman once known as Marie Antoinette faded from public speech, but not from private thought. In secret circles, those who had once admired her whispered of her grace, her final words, her quiet strength. Some clutched her letters, her portraits, the fragments of her presence that had escaped the flames. Others, once aligned with the revolution, began to question the brutality they had unleashed. If this was liberty, they thought, why did it feel so much like vengeance? And yet, the machinery of control pressed on. The official narrative was clear. She had been a parasite, a foreigner, a traitor. Her execution was necessary, inevitable, just. But underneath that tidy story lived another darker, more complex, and far more human. It was the story of a woman who had married into a world she never fully understood, who had been raised to perform, not to rule, who became a queen at 19, a mother at 23, a widow at 37, and a corpse before 40. Her downfall had been written by many hands, aristocrats, pamphleteers, revolutionaries, even her own husband. But the execution itself was not the final chapter. The true horror of Marie Antoinette's end was not the blade, but everything that led to it, the isolation, the slander, the betrayal, the theft of her children, the daily erosion of her sense of self. They didn't just kill her. They erased her one cruelty at a time. And her children? They too bore the scars. Her daughter, Marie Therese, was the only immediate family member to survive the revolution. She was imprisoned for years, kept in darkness and solitude, left with only scraps of memory to make sense of the silence that had swallowed her parents. Her brother Louis Charles, the lost Dauphin, died in a filthy prison cell at the age of 10, neglected, abused, and ultimately forgotten by the very state that had used him to destroy his mother. These were not executions. These were obliterations. Kind of punishments meant not just to end lives, but to erase legacies, to ensure no memory of resistance, of humanity, of sorrow could survive. The guillotine may have severed heads, but the real blade cut deeper. It carved history into something manageable, palatable, controllable. Yet, even centuries later, the sanitized versions of Marie Antoinette's life failed to hold. The myth of the careless queen, of let them eat cake, of decadence and frivolity, crumbles when placed beside the raw cruelty of her final days. She may have lived in excess once, but she died in deprivation. She may have worn diamonds, but she bled like any woman. She may have danced at Versailles, but she was dragged through mud to her death. And in that collapse of image, we begin to see her clearly, not as saint, not as villain, but as woman, as mother, as scapegoat, as victim of a nation's rage too, vast to be directed anywhere else. The story of Marie Antoinette's death, when stripped of propaganda and legend, is not just a historical event, it is a profound warning. A case study in how societies, when consumed by desperation and fear, can lose their humanity one cut at a time. Her fall was not solely the result of excess or political missteps. It was the product of narrative warfare, of a public so starved for justice that it mistook cruelty for fairness, vengeance for victory. They did not simply execute a queen. They engineered a spectacle. They orchestrated her psychological collapse, dismantled her maternal bonds, and poisoned her name until it was unrecognizable. Her death, like Anne Boleyn's centuries before, was not the end, but the climax of a prolonged campaign to annihilate her as a symbol. The method was modern in its precision. Isolate, humiliate, fabricate, destroy, and what was gained? The revolution did not halt its descent. The monarchy had fallen, yes, but the violence continued. Robespierre himself would meet the guillotine. Less than a year after Marie, and many who had cheered her death would eventually be consumed by the very blade they had once praised. Tyranny, it seemed, had simply changed costumes. Still, history remembers her differently now, not as the girl from Austria who danced through Versailles without a care, but as a tragic figure, flawed, yes, but human. A woman caught in the storm of a collapsing world order. A queen who had no real power to wield, yet bore the full weight of her people's rage. Her letters from prison, once suppressed, now reveal a woman trying desperately to hold on to dignity, writing to her children with trembling hands and fading hope. Her final days were not those of a tyrant, but of a prisoner stripped bare. And still, something endured. The image of her final apology, "Pardon me, sir," has been replayed for generations. It resonates not because of its politeness, but because of its dissonance. In a moment crafted to reduce her to nothing, she remained someone. She acknowledged the man about to kill her. She held, for the briefest moment, a mirror to the brutality of her executioners, showing them what civility looked like. It is easy to judge her life through the lens of revolution. Easier still to dismiss her as a cautionary tale. But to truly understand Marie Antoinette's death is to confront the uncomfortable truth that violence disguised as justice can destroy more than lives. It can erase context, complexity, and the very humanity of its victims. Her story lingers not because she was royalty, but because her erasure was so complete and yet so impossible to sustain. In the silence that followed her execution, in the letters that survived, in the grief of her daughter and the testimony of even her enemies, a different narrative emerged, not one of cake and jewels, but of fear, grief, and survival. Marie Antoinette's legacy was nearly annihilated, but what remains is something stronger than memory. It is the haunting knowledge that once a society learns to dehumanize its enemies, it will never run out of reasons to feed the machine. She was not just beheaded. She was turned into a spectacle, a scapegoat, a shadow, and finally, a ghost. That history could not bury. And in that final truth, we see the most disturbing lesson of all. When the blade falls, it does not just divide flesh from bone. It separates narrative from reality. And what bleeds out is not only blood but truth.